chilly in our house this morning. In fact, it was colder inside the house than it was when we walked out. And so I just thought it'd be cold outside. So I walked out, I had a sweater and a jacket on. And I was a little disappointed when it was warmer outside than it was inside. I don't know what it was inside, probably in the low 60s since we didn't have the heat on. Is it the last hurrah before it gets to be 115 degrees? Maybe so. Maybe so. Well, good morning, everyone. The series that we began last week continues. So this is, I guess, the name of the series, Christ and Culture and the New Testament. Last week, we introduced kind of a setup, introduction. Today, Jesus and Culture. I realize that's ambitious for one class. Jesus and Culture. Next week, Christ and Culture in Corinth. Okay, going from Jesus to Paul. May the 3rd, Lord willing. I think we're still going to be in Paul, but the phrase here is, our citizenship is in heaven. So kind of a class devoted to that concept. So there's a week for that. May 10, aliens and exiles in 1 Peter. So if you've read Peter, those terms, depending on how your version renders it, are operative terms. May 17, the church and the world in John's writings. So we're going to hear from Jesus via the Gospels, Paul, Peter, and John. Now, all day, every day, I'm around old books in person. That's not all that goes on, but a lot. Okay? And sometimes I then hop online and see pictures of old books. So, I guess there's worse things to see online. I don't remember if I ran across this. Maybe it was on Facebook, maybe it was on an auction catalog or an auction website. Booksellers find me and want to sell me things. And they dangle these wonderful catalogs, and they're digital book catalogs, because obviously they're trying to pay the bills, and so they just reach out to being a special collections librarian that collects at the office rare books. Like, do you want to buy this? So I'm always getting sales catalogs. This may have come from one of those. I forget where it came from. Doesn't matter. It's a beautiful, handwritten prayer or wish or blessing inside a book. From best I can tell, it looks like Catherine, I don't know her last name, received this book on her wedding day from her mother. Looks like June 3rd, 1912. And in the front is just this gorgeous, beautiful, hand-illuminated, hand-written kind of prayer. And I thought, this is beautiful. Let me, if we were online, we would just share this. So what do? Old school, you print a copy and hand it out, which is much better, I think. It's nice to share things, but here's one that we can hold in our hand. I had this last week and then forgot till class was over. I wasn't looking for it, it found me. And so we're thinking about how the Christian faith relates to culture, I guess that's an overarching theme of this short series, or maybe how we as Christians ought to interact within our culture. Okay. What a sweet prayer to put in the front of a book. And I don't know what kind of book it was. All I see is the picture of the inscription. Okay. And it's not totally straight. All this was done by hand, kind of in the old style of medieval manuscript illustration, or as the technical term is manuscript illumination. So when you talk about a manuscript that's illuminated, it doesn't have the lights on, it has a decoration applied to the pages. And this is the kind of decoration that you would have seen in medieval manuscripts. So there's that ivy and the flowers and the gold. Often they'll do the first letter of a paragraph or a section, and maybe something along the margins, along the top, down the sides. It's just gorgeous. God be in my head and in my understanding. God be in my eyes and in my looking. God be in my mouth and in my speaking. God be in my heart and in my thinking. God be in my end and at my departing. $15.58. Okay, what's a serum primer? Okay, you could look it up. You Google it. Serum is Latin, and it's the Latin form of the name Salisbury, England. Yeah. How you get that as the Latin form of what we know as the town of Salisbury, I'm not sure. But somehow that's what it would be in Latin. Okay, a primer is kind of what you would, it's a prayer book. It's a primer in devotion. Okay, so this was published in the 16th century. It's probably rooted, this particular prayer, rooted in a French devotional book from the 14th century. And as I understand from a brief Google search, this little song or poem gets put to music and becomes a hymn or a song later on. Okay? So this is the book of prayers. It's a devotional book. Okay? So you may have something similar at home, just a book of prayers. Maybe it's a prayer a day. I don't know if you remember the old Power for Today little devotionals sometimes churches would have in the foyer. You know, there'd be a prayer, there'd be a little, maybe a verse from the Psalms, a little devotional thought, a hymn or a song, and a prayer for the day. Okay? This is something similar. Sometimes these are called books of hours. Hours as in hours of the day. Where at different points of the day, here's a prayer. Prayer at morning, prayer at evening. Okay. And so, looks like, I don't know who she is, but Catherine receives this book from her mother, June the 3rd, 1912. Isn't that sweet? Now, maybe this is helpful as we think about engaging within our culture. God be in my head and in my understanding, in my eyes and in my looking, in my mouth and in my speaking, in my heart and in my thinking, in my end and at my departing. Okay, having passed that out, again, let me say what I said last week. I'm just trying to help us think through all of this, and I realize these topics for one Sunday school class are very ambitious. Jesus and culture in 35 minutes is very ambitious. Paul and culture in Corinth is very ambitious for one class. But that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. Can't say everything. Can't be exhaustive. This is just a brief series to help us kind of think through what and how the New Testament interfaces within the cultures of that day, or maybe with the broader notion of culture. And so, last week, we talked about such important things as Appalachian slang and the strange ways that you Texans have out here. Okay, that was my way to introduce kind of what is culture. I was like, well, I don't know, it's just kind of the way things are for you, wherever you are, whenever you are, however you are. Taken on the positive side, it's all the charming, wonderful things that make you think of home. Okay. Like last week when it rained, and I thought, oh, that takes me back. That makes me feel comfortable and at home. Okay. In other words, the ways of being that give us meaning. So it's not just something that's familiar and a habit, but it's the meaning that we attach to those things, the rituals. Yes? Oh, mine. Yes. I don't know why it says, I'm not familiar with the rules of thee and thy and me and my and mine, but there are rules for those. I forget. Maybe it's the sound. My and I are close sound alike. So you'd say mine eyes. That may be it. So what gives you meaning? Or put it on the negative side, you move out here to Texas and you think, hey, these strange ways of these folks out here. They do things differently. We're not in Kansas anymore. Okay, that's a phrase that we use when like, well, this is not what I remember. The ways that people find meaning and make sense of the world out here are very different than they are, and insert the blank. Insert in the blank wherever it is you're from. Okay. For example, I didn't understand this. I mean, I understood what he meant. I didn't understand it as one who lives out here understands it. 30 years ago, when Ted Caruth in a summer class at Lipscomb, we're going through Mark, and Ted taught at Lubbock Christian before he came to Lipscomb. And I don't know where he was from out here. I think he was from Amarillo originally. Anyway, doesn't matter. He's from out here somewhere. And he's talking about, the ways that we think about things sometimes are shaped by where we're from. And his illustration is, where I'm from, out in West Texas, you look for miles and it's just nothing but open horizon. Anything's possible. Also, everything is possible. There is grand opportunity. You can look, he says, you just stand still and you look out and you can see everything. You're also vulnerable and exposed, and anything can happen. But he says, back where I'm from, we see all kinds of possibilities. We can do anything. There's nothing in our way. Literally, there's nothing in our way. We can do whatever we decide to do, we can do. He says, also, you realize you're very vulnerable. And it takes a certain kind of spirit to move to a place like that and think, in all seriousness, we can do whatever we set our minds to do. goes, that's very different than how it is over here. When I moved here, and got mountains and hills and hollows and hollers, okay? And you can't see the horizon. You're very hemmed in. And the landscape gives you a sense of comfort. And you don't necessarily need to see for miles around. You couldn't if you wanted to. And so the idea of staying put and stability over a long period of time, that's not a strange concept for how you think over here. He wasn't trying to say one is better and one is worse. He says just the way things are out where I'm from is a little different than the way things are here. When you wake up in the morning and you step out on your front porch, and what do you see? He says, you see the same hills and hollows that your grandparents saw and that their grandparents saw. You get out and you stand on your front porch, or you look west and you see a sunset that goes on for 1,000 miles. You see, don't fence me in. I can do anything I want, and I can. The opportunity is there, the danger is there, the adventure is there. Okay? So the language, the art, the music, the ways of speaking, the ways you organize your civic life, what you think is within bounds, what's out of bounds, or in other words, what's legal, what's not, so your law codes, the songs you sing to tell your story, that the rituals that you go through, again, just think your own family history. Probably you get around the table at the family reunion and tell the same stories. There may be huge chunks of time that you have no idea what happened. But there's always the one story of the one person. You know, the danger is that one person's life gets reduced to one anecdotal story, right? That's the danger. The flip side is that may be all you know. So of my ancestors, I know some of the names, and I only know them by name. Some I don't even know the name. We may have one or two stories, or three or four for a certain generation. Beyond that, one story of that generation. So of my great-great-grandfather, I know about three things. He was a farmer, according to the census, okay, in West Virginia, hills and hollows, same place his grandparents lived. He was an elder of the church at some point, probably preached, because I've got some of books of sermons that he would have had. I know that he may have preached them, don't know that, that's a question. His father was an elder at that church, and he died of appendicitis in his early 30s, left 6 little boys, little stair-steppers under the age of 12. That's about all I know. I know 3 or 4 facts, and one of them I'm not quite sure about, okay? Now, his father, I know he was in the Civil War. He was a musician, played the drum. And about the busiest they got was one afternoon at Harper's Ferry. And other than that, as far as I can tell, they pretty much sat still. They were involved in nothing. In fact, more men died from illness and disease in Company 6 of the West Virginia Infantry than anyone died. I think one guy may have shot himself in the foot at Harper's Ferry. There was nothing, okay? His parents, I know nothing. I know names and dates, that's all. So there may or may not be even stories to go along with your family kind of way of being that gets repeated. So the mythology that you repeat, the stories you repeat. Our family came from here and went there, and it was a mighty struggle, but we made a new life. Or we were running from the law, and we got away from them, okay? The stories you tell that give your existence some significance and meaning and make sense of it, something to pass on to the next generation. Okay, that's probably a long definition of culture. Okay, so as you shift gears and think about Jesus and culture, last week I mentioned there's a couple things that are pretty significant. For us today, talking about Jesus and culture, there's two things that I introduced last week that are just critical. One is the Christian confession about Jesus already in the New Testament is spoken of as folly, foolishness, a scandal, a stumbling block. We preach Christ crucified. Our confession is that Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God. Some will see that and say that is foolishness. That makes no sense. I will not orient my life and give it meaning around that claim. Okay? So already, kind of one presupposition to kind of put out there is when we make the Christian confession, we are running the risk at running across the grain of whatever culture we are in, given the stories that give meaning to that culture. And the confession that Jesus is the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah, the Christ of God, Son of the living God, that automatically, in some ways, will put us at odds. Now, the other presupposition, or kind of groundwork, that I laid out last week was prior to the Emperor Constantine, in about the 4th century, legislating on the part of the Roman government that Christianity was legal and legally practicable without penalty or persecution, ended about 300 or 400 years where we were on the outside of the prevailing culture, at least the prevailing political culture. The civic authorities, with the powers of the state, used those powers against those who made claims like Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. In other words, not in these parts, okay? Well, in the 330s, that changed, and in these parts, we will have an official religion of the state, and it will be that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that Constantinian shift from when we were on the outside, now we're on the inside of sorts, okay? Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, okay? But it was, okay, whatever meaning that carries along with that, that's a major shift. And then observed, we did, without rehashing too much of last week, how we relate to our larger culture has kind of wavered between that insider-outsider dynamic ever since. So let's think about Jesus and culture. So if you're going through the Gospels, there are certain incidents where Jesus' ministry kind of interfaced with the ways of being that give this group of people its meaning, or we would say culture. Okay? For example, we don't necessarily need to look at all these verses, but there may be a few we'll look at. If you think about Jesus' first miracle, was at a wedding, civic religious ceremony, and we do a thing, and the meaning of that thing is a little bigger than just the actions of the thing, okay? And there's traditions that go with that. Traditions of having meals, food and drink at the wedding. And that's the occasion that Jesus latches onto, and here's this miracle story in the midst of a wedding. Okay. then you think about the last, or one of the last miracles at Jesus' life. So we kind of think, what's the bookends? Well, there's this wedding, and then near the end, maybe it's one of the last, funeral. Remember, Lazarus dies, and they're going through the funeral. They're going through the mourning customs. There's a healing miracle in the midst of the rituals that we go through to help us make sense of the end of life. Okay? Also, the rituals we go through at the interment of a body. Okay, the burial. Lazarus coming, is there at the tomb? Lazarus, come out. Okay? Well, along the way, Jesus walks and talks, and you remember when he calls his disciples? Some of them are fishing. But here's a little kind of slice of the commerce of the day. I see you're fishing for fish. What if you fish for people? So they leave their nets and they follow him. There's some, like, how do you pay your light bill when you do that? I mean, there's a practical question that we all ask as kids. Well, when they left their profession, then what? Okay. They're fishing so they can pay taxes, right? The other guy in our group was on the other side of the tax collection desk. When we went downtown to the IRS, we opened, sitting at the window is Levi, right? And then you turn around and he's walking with you. So tax collection, taxation, a little sliver of cultural life, civic life. Matthew, Levi, leaves everything and follows Jesus. The fishermen leave their nets, follow Jesus. Jesus has this comment, if you want to look at Matthew 10. Look at Matthew 10, about verse 24. Okay, there's a lot going on. We can't unpack everything, but it's the paragraph that begins in our Pew Bible. It begins at Matthew 10, verse 16. Our Pew Bible gives us a hint with the paragraph headings as persecutions predicted. Okay, so Jesus, in his teaching to his disciples, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, so be as shrewd as serpent and innocent as doves. They'll hand you over to local courts, flog you in the synagogues. Okay, local court, civic court looks like. Maybe it's a religious court. Maybe it's both. Okay, flog you in their synagogue. So the persecution will happen in a religious setting. Persecution will happen in a court setting, or I guess a civil setting. You'll be brought before governors and kings because of me to bear witness to them and to the Gentiles. Okay, Gentile, that itself is kind of a cultural category, okay, kind of an ethnicity. I guess it's not an ethnicity, you're not Jewish, so it's everything other than Jewish, right? Okay. The day's coming. Verse 21, brother will betray brother to death, father his child. Children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You'll be hated by everyone because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. They persecute you in one town, go to another. I truly tell you, you will not have gone through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, or a slave above his master. So there's a couple of relationships. A tutor and a student, a master and a slave, a teacher and a student. not really an employer and employee, not like the slave often had options. You can't really, go find a better master. You're kind of stuck. So that's not quite parallel. But civic relationships, social relationships. A disciple's not above his teacher or a slave above his master. Point being is, this is going to happen to me. Should not be surprised when it happens to you. They called the head of the house Beelzebul. How much more the members of the house? So this is teaching to those who would make that confession and follow in the way of Jesus. Okay. What happens to me will happen to you. Okay. Well, if we were to go, that's Matthew 10. If you look at Mark 10, we looked at this several times. We were talking about, one, when we looked at Mark, when we went through Mark, we also thinking about elders. We looked at this passage. So what does it mean to be great in the kingdom of God? It means to serve. The exact opposite of what you would think would make you great. If by what you think of is having a position and exercising that position and enjoying that position makes you important. Jesus says, what's great is the one who serves. The nature of my confession is consistent with who I am and what I do. And what I have come to do is to serve. So those who would make the confession that they believe me and want to follow me should serve. That's Mark 10. Look around verse 42, 43. You know those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. They will not hesitate to exercise the prerogatives when it's in their best interest. Mark it down. When someone's self-interest is on the line and they have a prerogative, they will exercise it. And it doesn't matter who they step on. That's just how it works. Those in high positions act as tyrants. Okay? Not so among you. If you make the confession, Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah of God, that has implications for how you exercise your prerogatives. So if you have a position of leadership, or a position, period, okay, we want number one, I want number two, give us the positions. Jesus says to those who ask about having positions, that if you want greatness, it is to serve. Who wants to be first will be a slave to all. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. One who had all the prerogatives chose to serve. That means something for all those who would make that confession. And from one point of view, the downside to making that confession is people will absolutely take advantage of you. They will take your kindness and they will run right all over it. And they will mistreat you. And it will not be fair and it will not be right. Why are we surprised? That is exactly what they did to Jesus. They took advantage of his kindness, and what they did to him was not right. There are implications for that confession. Those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over wherever they can. Not so for you. So when we think about Jesus and culture, we think about what kind of community did Jesus form? It's a kind of community where the values of the community are your needs above mine, your best interest above my prerogative. And I said this when we talked about Mark, said when we talked about elders. If you have a group of folks who are so committed to one another to make sure your needs above my prerogatives, I don't know what we're going through, but somehow I think we'll be okay. It will change by the day sometimes, what we're facing. But if we all have that attitude, I'm getting into Paul here, it's easy to slide into Philippians 2. Okay, can't do that yet because we're not still talking about Jesus, not Paul. We'll talk about Paul later. It's easy to slide into Philippians 2, which is what I did the last time we talked about Mark 10, we talked about elders, is not have this attitude in you that was in Christ Jesus, that who did not regard equality with God as something to be greedily held on to, but rather emptied himself, taking the form of a slave and suffered even to the point of suffering on a cross. So had this mind in you that was in him. So if we all have the mind in us that was in Jesus, that's my prerogative is not as important as what I can do for you. I don't know how. Somehow we'll be okay. It's when someone says, I will demand my prerogative, and it does not matter what your needs are, that's when we'll have problems. Okay? Jesus comes in the very beginning of his, back to Mark, if you want to look at the beginning of Mark 1, 14, 15, John is arrested. Jesus goes to Galilee proclaiming the gospel, the good news of God. The kingdom of God has come. So the core, right, get right down to it. What about Jesus and culture? The new community that Jesus fashions is the reign of God, and it is here. And that is good news. Repent and believe it. So just right there, maybe that's the epitome of the notion of Jesus and culture. The story that we confess is that God is at work to do something brand new. And it has already happened. It's already started. That the kingly rule of God is here. We have repented and we believe it. Okay? If we were to go to one place, now that it's quarter till, one place to kind of get at the implications of that confession, I would turn us to the Sermon on the Mount to hear extended teaching from Jesus about life in this new kingdom. We begin to think through Jesus and culture. We see that Jesus interacted with people in all kinds of settings that reflected the cultural ways people were of the time. We should be surprised at that. Okay? He was in a particular time and place. And as he gives his teaching, we'll see some of that reflected. For example, in Mark 10 or Matthew 10. When you are persecuted, you should not assume that a slave would be above his master. Again, we don't have slaves and masters, but Jesus' point is, why should you expect any different treatment than what they've treated me? And that he kind of hangs that on a hook that they would understand. Teachers and students, slaves and masters. The great rule of God has come. The new community is here. I can't go read Ephesians 2 because, one, we're out of time. Two, that's kind of getting into Paul. And there's more to say, but if you were to look at Ephesians 2, Paul talks about what God has done is he has brought the two that are hostile or were hostile together in one body. He has reconciled them in the cross. God has done something in Jesus that has social and cultural implications, transcends social and cultural realities. He has made two into one body. He has done that. That's basically the second half of Ephesians 2. Again, kind of getting into Paul. I want to stay with Jesus for today, so we may get to Ephesians 2 later. Not next week, because James has us in Corinthians. So if you'd like, you want to read Corinthians, the Corinthian correspondence, 1st and 2nd, you'd be in a good place to help us think through what we'll do next week. Christ and culture in Corinth. May the 3rd, Lord willing, our citizenship is in heaven. So it looks like we're going to have a couple of weeks here thinking through some specific issues in Corinth and a civic or a political metaphor or image with citizenship. Okay. Food for thought. Like I said, we can't cover the whole waterfront of Jesus and culture, but hopefully this is a helpful way to begin. We'll see you next